into this larger history of ideas. And I was reminded that I actually encountered Rousseau for the first time. Well, not for the first time, but I began to understand his importance as a thinker when trying to understand events in Iran in the 1950s and 60s, where there was a massive intellectual archive created by obviously people educated in the West or educated in Western style institutions who were very inspired by Rousseau and who aimed their critique at the technocratic elite then running Iran, often Ivy League educated people who were seen by these intellectuals as disconnected from ordinary Iranians, people pursuing an agenda of modernization that empowered them greatly, and at the same time instilled feelings of contempt and distrust for ordinary people. So that was my sort of first introduction, more than a decade ago. And then I think once these sort of insurgencies started to erupt, first in India, then of course United States, in Europe, I started to read Rousseau more sort of systematically than I'd done before, and realized actually that in many ways he anticipates many of our problems, discontents, fears, anxieties. And this is because he's sort of he's present at the beginning of the modern age, by which I mean the age in which there's a sort of new set of ideas coming into play, the idea of freedom from external authority, whether the church or the monarchy, the idea that man can use reason to advance, the discoveries of science will help improve man's material lot, the idea that rational debate can be at the basis of politics, that self-interest is a major ingredient in progress. And so are commerce and trade, and also the idea that intellectual sophistication, cultural sophistication are worthy ideals. Now, Rousseau is there at this moment, and he emerges as a critic of many of these ideas. In that sense, he's a critic, internal critic of the Enlightenment. And his biggest adversary, of course, is Voltaire. Different social class, different location, and Voltaire is, of course, on the side of people who believe that greater wealth, prosperity, commerce, trade, the use of reason, this is inaugurating a new phase altogether in human history. And Rousseau is someone deeply skeptical of these notions, because he finds that the notion of intellectual talent, merit, which the philosophers are upholding and saying that this is a new way in which human individuals can identify themselves, can project themselves in society. For him, merit, I mean, again, there's been so much talk about, there's been actually now quite a series of books about meritocracy and how dangerous it is to the psychological health of many people who do not have the ability to acquire that kind of intellectual merit, or do not, or born in certain circumstances where they're not able to acquire those. And he was already there in the late 18th century, critiquing this notion of intellectual talent, intellectual merit, and saying that this is, we are making an entire class of people, working classes, peasants, we make them feel ashamed because they have inferior cognitive abilities. And if you reduce the value of a person's life to their intellectual talents, then a lot of people are going to feel very, very painful existential anxieties and become very vulnerable to a sense of worthlessness. So this is sort of this particular notion of vanity, of self-interest that is very commonplace in his time, and he emerges as the most radical critic of these notions. And I think it has partly to do with his biography, not actually coming from a metropolitan location, but from somewhere just outside it, from Geneva, not belonging to a patrician family or even a sort of stable middle class family, having seen social inequality early in his life. All of that sort of creates this very intriguing character. I mean, Isaiah Berlin called him the greatest militant lowbrow in history. Which is absolutely right. I mean, I think until actually Donald Trump came along and challenged and made a claim on that distinction. But in many ways, he's a sort of precursor of all those many hundreds of millions of people who have felt left behind by the march of modern civilization, by the ideologies of progress, who feel that these have not worked out for them, and they have actually left them feeling not only left out, but actively scorned and marginalized. So in that context, I think his ideas, his diagnosis in particular, there's of course his solutions, political community, and I think he's also important. Because he does give an importance to political activity, which again, I mean, not very few people at the time were giving. I think many of his peers were perfectly happy with the idea of an aristocratic ruling class, but he's actually interested in democracy, inequality, in the equality of citizens. So those are also again incendiary ideas, and in many ways we're still seeing the revolution he sort of sparked off, working his way around the world.
And as you say, he's an internal critic. I always feel with him, and this connects to the nature of it too, that he does understand it from both sides, in the sense that there are different Rousseaus. There's the Rousseau of the Confessions, there's the Rousseau of the Social Contract, there's the Rousseau of the Discourses, who's the one I'm most interested in. And the Rousseau of the Discourses gets the way in which that dynamic that you described with the rise of arts and commerce and science, and the creation of these new classes of people rising by their brain power and so on, creates a class of people who feel left behind and looked down on. But it's a trap for the intellectuals as well. I mean, he sees it both ways. He sees the way in which it's this mutual relationship. And contemporary politics has so much of that in it, in the sense that the intellectual can see how terrible it is to be so patronizing. The elites can see the danger of it. And yet there's such a strong sense often that they can't see a way out. And that, I mean, so the social contract and so on is a sort of way out, a radical and quite demanding, as he said, austere way out. But as a diagnostic of it, it really speaks to me that the mutual trap. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think in many ways, I mean, he's sort of describing a kind of impasse for political society, for this new community, this new society in general, but also for people who've set themselves up as a sort of intellectual arbiters of that society. I think in many ways Nietzsche sort of advances that critique, but I think in also more fundamental philosophical ways. But I think Rousseau is also very concerned with social class and the injuries of class in a way that Nietzsche is simply not. And he's kind of he tends to see too much through this prism of ressentiment, and it's too. Again, I mean, I think he's simply not aware of the political and economic context in which Rousseau is arguing. And of course, I think it becomes these problems that Rousseau has diagnosed become more and more acute because in many ways the society he's describing is a pre-industrial society. It's not fully developed capitalist society. Once industrial capitalism gets underway, so then those problems of specialist elites, technocratic elites, ruling classes, the gap between ruling classes and ordinary people becomes wider. And then of course you have this other great diagnostician of modernity emerge in the mid-19th century, Marx, who's obviously interested in a different kind of contradiction between labor and capital. But I think Rousseau still seems the more acute diagnostician of the divide itself, of the kind of bourgeois mentality, and of the general impasse of modernity. I think just at the moment that it begins, that there are some really very severe, crippling contradictions in this project, and those contradictions are actually they originate in the very soul of the bourgeois individual that we're all aspiring to be, moving away from our villages and small towns.
And do you think it's partly the extra acuity with Rousseau because he is the author of the Confessions? So there's that other aspect to him. He's in a way the first great modern confessional psychological autobiographer, and that book is such a strange book because it's so off-putting in so many ways. It's so creepily modern in so many ways, and creepy as well. But he's almost unique as a political analyst in having really looked into himself. I mean, really looked in and not shied away from what he saw. Although he then dressed it up, but he didn't shy away from it.
Absolutely, and posits no easy redemption for himself either. I mean, it's not religion is not waiting there to save him. It's a really very unvarnished look at the most sordid aspects of human behavior as manifested by his own self. So in that sense, he's a sort of really unsparing witness to these sort of contradictions that he sees in this new commercial society in general, but also, I mean, he can see it so clearly because he can see his own pain, he can see his own sort of divisions so clearly. And I'm sure he felt too, like Voltaire, there's attraction to people from the aristocracy, from ruling classes, the idea that he too could be a counselor to the powerful, have their ear. I'm sure he felt those impulses too within himself. And at the same time, felt also the deep shame that went into those impulses. Probably keener, felt them more deeply than the people who were actually counseling the powerful, like Voltaire.
The shame with Rousseau, and then as you say with Nietzsche, there's ressentiment. And I mean, I describe them in the series of talks I did as the two great unmaskers. They see through. There's a kind of almost magical quality to what they see behind and through. But with Nietzsche, you also get this thing that's not there with Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau understands powerlessness and he understands the trap of power. But what you get with Nietzsche's genius is to see that the powerless will find an outlet. That famous line that people would rather will nothing than not have a will. They will find an out. And in the age of anger, you do, I think, if I get this right, you do see that in 21st century populism. You do see it in the anger, particularly of the young, but not exclusively of the young. Is that what you get from Nietzsche, that sense that people, the many, countless millions of people who are relatively powerless in this world, nonetheless are always looking for outlets for their will to power, to use the Nietzschean phrase?
Absolutely.